Okay, Dave Olson. So it would appear that Donald Trump has managed to bring out what the 12 preceding presidents and 11 seasons of MASH couldn't, an end to the war on the Korean Peninsula. How much credit does Trump really deserve, and what do you think really brought this about? Happens to be the topic of my right angle this week, which I don't know if you've seen yet. But that was pretty cold there, T-Dog Lies, saying that Clavin stole them. That was pretty low. Yes, he deserves the credit. He doesn't deserve the credit. In fact, this is actually kind of the point, right? He doesn't deserve the credit for having this genius, intricate plan to weave his way through the intricacies of the Korean Peninsula situation, which is exactly like the Gordian knot. It's an aneurysm. It's an 80-year-old, 70-year-old aneurysm. Everything's connected to everything else, and there is no brilliant master plan that only somebody who went to Harvard School of Foreign Relations can handle. I think the answer to the question is simple. If we get a peace treaty, or we certainly get something that looks like ends the war, because the war is still technically on, Donald Trump will have done it, and that's because Donald Trump will have done something that none of the previous administrations that you mentioned have done. And that is very, very simple. Donald Trump scared Kim Jong-un. He scared him. I think it's unkind, but it's the outside of the truth. It's possible that Kim Jong-un took a look at Donald Trump, and when he started calling him Rocket Man, he may say, this guy's crazier than I am. He might actually do it. And so Donald Trump deserves credit for the Korean unification if it comes to that. In any event, the tensions are way, way down because of everything we believed. It was another indication that everything we believe is correct, that it's great to cooperate with people. It's great to, to make concessions in order to get things what you want with civilized people. That's fantastic. It's how everybody should be living life. But there are some people who are not that way. And liberals can't understand this. And they never will. Their entire idea of human nature is such that, everything that you do is only, you only do what you do because of what I do. You just react to me. So if if you decide to knock down some of my skyscrapers, that's because I've been doing something that hurts your feelings. So if I stop doing it, then you won't do it anymore. It's incredibly self-centered and narcissistic, but that's what 5-year-old children are like generally. So Trump scared him, and that's why ISIS is gone too. One of the reasons ISIS it's gone. I don't want to say it's not. I don't want to be smacked on the face with this, have an attack happen tomorrow, but I do know people who've been in this fight, and they are essentially gone, because Donald Trump's first act was his first day, second day as president. He dropped the largest non-nuclear weapon in the arsenal on an ISIS position. That's a statement. Barack Obama was giving these guys warnings. He was telling them you have to radio them and tell them that the airstrike is coming. Give them half an hour, 45 minutes to get away. I'm not making this up. It's really true. And Obama, was talking with Kim Jong-un and the Iranians, and we'll promise them this and we'll give them that, and maybe we can pay them to be nice, all the rest of it. No. Trump just basically said, dude, if you continue with this, you're going to die. And I'm not kidding. And Kim Jong-un looks at ISIS and says, Kim Jong-un looks at the Middle East, right? Obama says, well, there's a red line in Syria. If Assad gasses his own people, that's it. That's the red line. Beyond that, we will take action. So Assad gasses his own people, we do nothing. What do you think that tells Kim Jong-un and the Iranians and everybody else? Donald Trump gets into office on the next day after Mad Dog Mattis is sworn in as defense secretary, which is the greatest defense secretary in the history of the world simply because of his name. And then the next day, Trump, look, I don't have the exact details of that particular compound, but certainly there are weapons that we could use that would be as effective or close to as effective as this. Dropping the Moab Dropping the fuel air explosive bomb was an act of showmanship. It was a symbolic act. It was just okay, here you go. And this, if Korea, I think unification's a long way down the road, but if there is a peace treaty signed, and I think that's possible and maybe even likely, if the Korean War finally comes to an official end after 68 years or whatever it's been, it will be because Donald Trump scared this guy into a third path. Prior to this, Kim Jong-un was juggling a pretty precarious situation. I suppose I should say tightrope walking. On one hand, he has to be tough on the United States. He has to launch these missiles. He has to have all of the prestige, because if he doesn't, he's going to fall from within. Either his generals or the people are going to revolt. They know that you have to be strong and maintain an outside enemy so that you don't get gunned down by your own palace guard. So that's one side he doesn't want to tip to. So the more he leans towards, pushing and bullying the United States, in the past, that strategy has been a very good strategy, because he's been pretty convinced, and so was his father and grandfather, we weren't going to do anything, and we didn't do anything. Now he's up against a guy that says, no, those days are over. You're not going to get to come over here and just keep taunting us. So if you do, you're going to die. You personally, your regime and all the rest of it, but we know you don't care about that. You don't care anything about the other people. You don't care anything about the people in your country. But you personally are going to go. You're going to go. Buried alive, likely. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. And then what position does that put Kim in? Well, I have to do something to maintain the prestige of my people. I was poking the great Satan in the eye, but apparently that's not going to work anymore. And I suspect that Kim got the idea. I'll bet you anything that somebody whispered this in his head, because I don't suspect that Kim has the ability to come up with an idea like this. I may be wrong about that, but somebody somewhere said, you could go down as the great peacemaker. What now? You could go down as the great peacemaker. You could be the leader of the world who basically brought peace to the Korean Peninsula. And I think that appealed to that nasty little man. I think it appealed to him quite a lot. And I think most of the reason it appealed to him is because it was way out of his bunker-busting destiny. It was a chance to get out of this two-sided box with, I don't want to say honor exactly. Prestige is a better word. Face. He gets to save face. And by the way, as I was saying earlier, for those people on the left who think that this is just a coincidence, it's the same kind of coincidence as Iran releasing 52 American hostages after holding them for 444 days, about an hour before Ronald Reagan took office. Remember that? Remember how Jimmy Carter was nice to them and kind of apologized, and he sent them cakes and Bibles and all of this stuff, and then he launched an abortive raid that was a catastrophe, but served a larger purpose because of the Desert Eagle? The rescue attempt was such a catastrophe that it really had the military basically just go down to the, back down, take the paint off, go to the bare metal, and Delta Force came out of that catastrophe and all the rest of it. So yes, they did the calculation. Kim did the calculation that unlike Obama, there was a very good chance that they were going to wake up one day and be dead. And when you think about it, the one thing that all dictators, Desert One, thank you, Foghorn. The one thing that all dictators have in common is, needless to say, pathological, murderous ego. It's all about their ego. Hitler did everything. I was blessed by God. There will never be another chance like this, and all the rest of it. And the only reason that Hitler committed suicide was because somewhere, probably a year earlier, let's say after Kursk, seems like a pretty good place. After the Germans failed to win the Battle of Kursk, I think Hitler realized, okay, this is over. And so once he realized that external forces were going to end his life, he then decided that if I'm going to go down, I'm going to go down in the biggest inferno in history. I'm going to take the world with me. It's well known that Hitler had issued orders for the destruction of German factories, every single bridge in Germany, all of it, didn't matter where it was coming from. He wanted all of it blown up, all of the food supplies blown up. He had Berliners in the subways hiding from Allied bombs. He wanted to flood those so that the Russians couldn't use them. He wanted to take the whole world with him, because if he was going to die, he was going to have the world die with him. And, there you go. Stalin died of a stroke. He personally ordered the murder of many, many more people than Adolf Hitler ordered the murder of. It doesn't make much difference. You're on the receiving end, I guess. But Hitler never signed anything that I'm aware of. I don't think he ever. Please, just so we're crystal clear, okay? I'm not saying he didn't do it and he didn't know about it. He simply made it clear this is what he wanted done. That's how the Nazi regime worked. Everybody was working towards the Führer. And he wouldn't sign a document like that. He went for a little walk with Himmler. Himmler went for a walk with Heydrich. Heydrich went for a walk with Eichmann. And that's how it goes. But Stalin signed thousands of warrants. And there are many cases, hundreds of pages on each one of those. I want to say that on one day, he and Molotov and one other person, maybe it was Malenkov, I'm not sure, signed something like 300 individual pages of executions. And Stalin would look, and he had a phenomenal memory, and he was a very, very smart man. But Stalin would look at these things, and he'd just be going down the list, down the list, down the list, and every now and then, he'd see a name and he'd put a little green tick with it next to it in a green colored pencil. He just put like a tick. And that person wasn't to be touched. And you find that one of these people was a school teacher of his like 27 years ago when he was exiled out in the middle of nowhere. And he's just going through this list of hundreds of thousands of names over, 25, 30 years. And he sees this guy. It was before Beria. And he just sees the name and says, "Oh, I know him. I'll let him live." By the way, since you mentioned Beria, that meant it couldn't. It had to be. It must have been Yezhov, because Yagoda was not in on this kind of industrial murder scale. Yagoda murdered a bunch of people working on the Baltic, working on the White Sea Canal, but you didn't get into. Yezhov is a name that very few people know. I think you're pretty solid ground to say that Yezhov killed more people in his 1 or 2 years than Himmler did in 4 or 5. I'm not saying that's something you should try to emulate. But Yezhov. Yezhovchina, I think they called it, the time of Yezhov. Called him my Blackberry because it's a play on words for Yezhov. And he was 5 foot tall, or maybe a little less. Seemed like a really nice guy. Everybody said he was a real nice guy. Yezhov would work for 20 hours a day every day for the 2 years he was in charge of the OGPU or the MG, whatever it was. They changed the name, NKVD changed the name so many times. In any event, Yezhov was in charge of it, the secret police. He'd work 20 hours a day. He'd get a couple of hours sleep, because Yezhov, unlike Himmler famously went to watch one execution of Jews. He went out there, and it was one of these Aesops group and one of these death squads out there, and they said, "Oh, Herr Reichsführer, would you like to witness this execution of the Jews?" And Himmler kind of said, "Well, yes, of course, that was absolutely yes." And Himmler stood there while they gunned down these people and let them fall naked into a pit, and Himmler started vomiting. He got sick. He was sick for the rest of the day. He had to retire for a couple of days. Yezhov, every single day, would finish with his paperwork, which was compiling lists of people to kill. And every single day, Yezhov would put on his black leather trench coat and he'd march the short little distance, or undoubtedly he rode in a limousine. Yezhov went the very short distance from his office in the Kremlin over to the Lubyanka. And Yezhov would, because he was king of Lubyanka, that was his building, along with Leforto Fortress, which was the hardcore school. Not that it mattered, you're going to die in both places anyway. Yezhov would go every night for the 2 or 3 years that he was in charge of the secret police, go down to the basement, be part of the interrogations, and then basically watch the executions. Or many times reported where people would have a meeting with Yezhov or something, and they'd notice that there were like tiny little specks of blood on his collar, and that's what he did. He just went down there and they shot people. And one of the reasons, the main reason that we don't hear about these kind of things, is because the left owns the news media, and this is what happens with socialism and communism. So even though the Nazis were National Socialists, they pretend that's not true. But I'll maintain this to my dying day. The reason that everybody's horrified at the Nazis, and very few people have any awareness of how much more horrific the communists were, if only because they did 10 times the number and over 10 times the period. The reason that nobody knows about that, and the reason that we I think it was Kingsley Amos's son, Martin Amos. Martin Amos said, yeah, this is it. Why is it that when we mention Nazis, we all get sick, but when we mention Bolsheviks, everybody kind of laughs a little bit? And he said, it's because, I think it's because there were no pictures. I think it's just that simple. I think if there hadn't been pictures of the death camps, if all you had seen of Auschwitz was just the room, that'd be one thing. But the thing that put the Nazis where they belonged was one image, basically. One. Because the gas chamber at Auschwitz is just a concrete room. You can be told any number of things happened there, and that's fine. They did. But there's one image, I think. One. And that is the image of somebody with a bulldozer bulldozing human bodies that look like mummies. Piles of human beings, starved absolutely to the bones. Piles of them being pushed with a bulldozer. That image is inescapable. I mention this probably every 5 or 6 months or so. If you really want to know what the Soviet Union was like, and what the Cheka was like, and all of their successors, you need to get yourself some Dramamine for nausea, and watch a film on YouTube called The Chekist. It's in Russian, and there's a version in English or a version with English subtitles that's of rather poor quality. But in any event, the Chekist is just about the business of the Lubyanka, which is every single night. The Black Marias go through these black police vans, basically. Every single night, the Black Marias go through the town of Moscow. Every single night, people lie awake until 2 or 3 in the morning because they're usually done by then. Every single night, these people in this city would, just as not only as human as you and I, they're just regular people, would sit there and they'd lie awake in fear, and then they'd hear a car door close outside of their flat. A few minutes later, they'd hear the elevator start. And at that point, they were like rabbits, just completely cornered by wolves. Their hearts are just pounding every night. And many survivors of this talked about the physical relief that came over them when they heard that the elevator had gone past their floor, and that the Cheka, or the secret police, whatever they morphed into, was coming to take away their neighbors. And in the same cases with the Germans, a lot of people said, oh, look, there's a new, bigger flat for us to go move to. But these people were put in every night. They just go through Moscow and round up a certain number of people. And I know I've been up and down this many times before, but this to me is the actual genuine moral horror of the Soviet Union that somehow even the Nazis didn't achieve, because the Nazis were trying to kill Jews, and that's genocide. I don't take anything away from that. You've heard me react to somebody who said that the Holocaust didn't happen, but the communists had quotas of people. Stalin would say 15,000 people have to be executed in Ekaterinburg. 15,000 have to be executed. What for? Doesn't matter. That's the number. You have to come up with 15,000. And since the secret police executed their predecessors, one case, some major office in the Soviet Union had 4 people in the chair in something like 7 days. One guy came in, he was shot that day. Another guy came in, lasted a day, he was shot. Another guy came in, lasted 2 days, he was shot. And then the fourth guy lasted probably a couple of years. But the point is, they would simply say, you must go out and murder this many people. And sometimes it'd be random, but they would go on the slightest kind of a denunciation. And here's where the machine gets its fuel. You would think that you wouldn't denounce somebody. You can't be signaled out for not doing something, right? You'd think that you wouldn't denounce your neighbors, but that's not how it worked. Because what would happen is they would get the people in the secret police would get a memo saying that you must execute 15,000 people. Well, the police chief in Ekaterinburg, let's say, gets a memo from Stalin saying you have to execute 15,000 people, traitors, to the motherland, enemies of the people. And so what he would do is he wouldn't execute 15,000 people. He'd execute 26,000 people. And he would report back to Stalin that there was much more, in the way of wreckers and imperialists and former people, because by doubling the quota, he was showing Stalin how down he was with the whole idea and what a great little apparatchik he was, and he could be trusted and counted on. He basically, they all went out and murdered more people than they were even told to murder because it was a survival strategy for them, so they thought. And same thing with the denunciations, right? It's true, you don't have to denounce your neighbor. You don't have to invent something about your neighbor. But let's just say you've got 2 innocent parties. It becomes the prisoner's dilemma, right? You have 2 innocent parties live across the hallway from each other. One decides not to denounce the other because neither one of them have done anything wrong. And the other guy says, well, I haven't done anything wrong, and since haven't been denounced, that's one thing. But because I haven't denounced someone else, that does make me suspect. So I'm going to turn these family in, and that'll make me look like a good Soviet citizen. And that's how the thing just accelerated. It just went faster and faster and faster. And at the same time that it accelerated, it also took a much longer period of time. I don't know what the numbers were. I used to know. And I want to say that in Treblinka, it's going to be another one-question show. 2 questions because both of them are about Korea. I've said many times the thing that horrifies me most about Treblinka is how unbelievably small it was. It was just as a truck stop. It was an interchange. It was a freeway interchange. The size of a large truck stop on Interstate 10. That's how big Treblinka was. They killed 1 million people there, 900,000, 850,000, something like that. But the whole thing in the Lubyanka was for 30 years. Certainly not at the same pace as during the Great Terror when Yashov was really getting into the heavy lifting. They would simply have their police cars go through the streets of Moscow, pick up either dissidents, suspected dissidents, or just people, who had been turned in by other terrified people. And it's easy to say, how could they? What a bunch of moral cowards. But we have not ever lived under that kind of fear, and we're in no position to make any judgments about them. We are in no position to judge those people. We've never known that kind of fear in this country, and I do the work I do because it's my mission to make sure that we don't. And same for all of you watching this. And I'll tell you one thing, by the way, just parenthetically, while we've never known the kind of fear that existed in Nazi Germany among Jews or among people in the Soviet Union, I can tell you, speaking for myself, I've had a taste of it. I'm not claiming I lived under it, but I've had a taste of it. I have a personal connection to the intimidation methods used by these fascist bastards. But the Lubyanka was 6 at a time, right? I mean, the gas, I got distracted again, the gas chambers at Auschwitz, hundreds of people at a time. And at Treblinka, I want to say there was maybe 50 or 200 in each one of the 6 gas chambers that they had there. And they would push these people in so tight that when they opened the doors at Treblinka, they had a door, people went in, and they packed them in there as tight as they could get them. Then they sealed those doors, and then they gassed them, and then the other side of the wall opened up. Just the whole wall basically opened. The steel doors opened, so they could put them on their little trolleys and dump them in a pit. And many times, the Jews who got another few days' worth of life by being, the labor for that camp. And let me be clear about this too. If I was offered a few days more life, I'd do it too, and so would you. They would find that these people were packed in there so tight that after they were all dead, they couldn't get them out of there. They, honest to God, had to get crowbars, big metal bars to pry the people loose. And once they got a few of them loose, the rest of them would just kind of fall out. So that's kind of a big dramatic thing. But in the Lubyanka, as you see in the checklist, 6 at a time, just 6 people, stark naked, stand up against the wall. Everybody knows what's happening. Everybody knows what's happening. The most touching scene in that movie, it's a scene I've actually reproduced a little bit in the script I was working on the other day, is the most heart-wrenching scene in that movie is you see all these people going naked to stand in front of this wall, and they're just standing here watching the previous group get shot and the previous group before them shot. And this one woman walks by and she says, I have a cat at home, could somebody just take care of my cat? Don't worry, we'll take care of your cat. I bet they would. And I've gotten old enough to understand that there are many things that you can't understand until you get there. So I'll just tell you how I feel now. One of the things, where did I read this? I think it was in Valerie Grossman's, who wrote Life and Fate. But I think it was about his multi-page article of his. He was there when they liberated, when the Soviets liberated Treblinka. He was there. He was a Red Army reporter. He was talking about the process, what it actually felt like, what actually happened to you once your train stopped in the town outside of the camp, first to the moment where they tossed you in the pit. And he made a really interesting point, and something I had not considered at all. But he basically said that one of the things about having people take their clothes off is that when you're standing there naked, it is such a shockingly unfamiliar and embarrassing and humiliating and incapacitating experience that just the fact that they were naked made it much, much easier for them to get people to stand in line and watch themselves move down the conveyor belt to their death. I know I'm going back and forth between the Soviets and the Nazis, but it's a pretty short bridge, really. They also, he also said, I'm quite sure it was Valerie Grossman, also said that combine the fact that they're naked. They killed the men first, because if they'd killed the women first, the men would have heard the screams of the women, and that would have snapped them out of it. there would have been a riot. They called them a transport, a group of people. 1,200 people was a transport. Every single transport would have been an enormous fight and a riot if the men had heard their women screaming. So they killed the men first, and the women heard the men screaming, but it's not the same reaction. But he said, combination so brace yourself, guys. Try and keep this as manageable as I can be, but this is fairly shocking. People know about this. So they said that here's the procedure that happens. You go in. They're gentle to you at first. There's a fake sign that says Treblinka train station. There's even a clock that's painted on the wall at Treblinka, to reassure everybody that this was just a transit spot. We're going to get some food or maybe take a shower or whatever. And so they got people. They're very nice to them, very kind to them, and reassuring them, giving them hope. You may be here a couple hours longer than we thought. The latest transports, to Ukraine are really being slow, and they're thinking, oh, thank God, because you'll grasp at straws, you'll do anything. He said once they got those people naked and separated, the first thing they did after they got them out of the barracks is they immediately started shouting at them, and everybody had to run. And if you weren't running, you were shot dead. And the other thing they did, this is the part I told you to brace yourselves for, is they committed acts of such unimaginable violence in front of the people that they were simply shocked into inaction. They'd grab a little kid, 2-year-old girl, one of these guards would grab her by the heels and just smash her against the wall, smash her brains out. Crying babies, they just kick them through the air like a soccer ball. And when you saw this, you simply became unhuman in some way. I remember, and fans of the show and fans of my career will tell you this is one of the Genesis stories for me. I remember seeing a picture of Jews lined up as a little boy. I was 6, 7 years old, and I asked my dad. This is the very first essay I ever wrote. I remember saying to my dad, "How? I don't understand. There's 200 people in line. There's 3 soldiers with bolt-action rifles. Even at 7, I was able to see that. They can see that they're being executed. It's not like it's a surprise. Why would they just stand in line like that?" And my dad said, "I don't know, Billy. I just don't think I would do it. I don't think Americans would do it." And I suspect my dad is probably right. But then I read about the power to shock you. And actually, on retrospect, I suspect I may be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But hasn't it ever struck you? Have you not ever been just simply somewhat amazed at the docility of people when they're about to be executed? Now, if you're in the middle of a crowd in Paris and they're marching you up to the guillotine or something, you can fight. Where are you going to go? But so many cases of people just kneeling down, just kneeling down, waiting to die. I don't know. And, we train as pilots and as soldiers and as nurses, and everybody trains for whatever job they do. We train because we want to be able to react in the appropriate fashion when it actually happens and our critical facilities will not be there. Best thing I ever heard about this was my flight instructor said this 1,000 times too. My flight instructor told me on my second flying lesson, he said, "Bill, if there's an emergency in the air and things go wrong, you are going to revert to your reptile brain, and my job is to make sure that the reptile knows what to do." I thought that's it in a nutshell. But I think about these things. I think about them to train myself. I actually spend a reasonable amount of time, certainly whenever I encounter one of these images, and I ask myself, I know if I were there, I'd be frozen with fear. I have no doubt I'm made out of the same stuff as these people, not trying to claim I'm braver than them or anything. On the contrary. But I look at this and I say to myself, the chance of this happening is exceedingly unlikely, and this is going to make my wife very unhappy. I know she doesn't like this kind of thing. Sorry, baby, but this is the show. That's what we do. I train myself and prepare myself many, many times to say, "Bill, if you ever find yourself in a line of people about to be executed, it's going to probably depend on you to make sure that everybody else understands that they have to sell themselves as dearly as possible. Not saying you're going to escape. I suppose there's a chance of it. But you are going to be the one who's going to have to snap people out of it. Because if there is a chance, and I take back what I just said, there is a chance. It's a chance. A chance is better than nothing. You will have to be the one, likely, who's going to have to muster the moral, not even courage, just the awareness, snap out of that thing and make it clear to the rest of the people, we either jump these guys now or we're all going to die. And the reason I'm somewhat encouraged about this is because, and why I suspect that Americans may be different, I have only 2 data points on this. One of them is Flight 93 on September 11th, the only plane where the passengers knew what was going to happen was the only plane that the passengers prevented that from happening. In other words, Flight 93 knew what had happened in the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and they knew that if they didn't get into that cockpit and get those guys out and kill them and have somebody take over the plane, then they're all going to die. In a weird sort of way, there's no heroism involved there. It's like, this is it. It's a choice. We can either storm the cockpit and have a chance, or we just die, period. That's it. Those are the 2 choices. So Americans, the flight was a third full, maybe half full. And the people that led this charge, accountants, graphic designers, gay men, just regular Americans, they simply went in there and did it. And people who have heard the flight recorder, I'm not one of them, but people who've heard the cockpit voice recorder say that when the Americans got through the door in Flight 93, that the fight that occurred in the cockpit as the plane is going down, that fight was the most vicious thing they've ever heard, and that these terrorists were screaming in fear. Just screaming. So, that's one example. A better example, and I haven't seen the movie, I just got buried, I suspect because the subject matter is too embarrassing for so many people. The second example was the one that happened just, I'll say 4 or 5 years ago now. Muslim terrorist comes on a train in Paris, high-speed train, which means it doesn't stop very often. He gets on a train. He's got an AK-47 and a bunch of other weapons. He walks into one of these compartments, basically starts making his speech. He's going to kill everybody. He says he's going to kill everybody. We know this because one of the Frenchmen went to a phone in the back of the train and called his wife to say goodbye. And that everybody on the train were getting ready to call their wives and say goodbye, and their husbands and all the rest of it. And 3 people got up and rushed this guy. And the only 3 people on that entire train compartment that rushed this guy were the 3 Americans that were on the train. That's a pretty compelling data set, if there were 3 Americans and 5 Frenchmen, or 3 Americans and 2 Frenchmen, but if the only ones who get up and rush the guy, the only ones are Americans, that tells you something. That's not coincidence, not that kind of thing. I like to think that's the case. I always like to think about things that are going to happen so that I'm prepared for them, and I have a strange sort of it's just a sense. My sense is that if I'm prepared for something, it's not going to happen. That the act of preparing myself, I don't know if I really believe much in destiny or fate, but I certainly believe that if you are prepared for an emergency, you will do better in that emergency. That I've had very close personal experience with. So I try to prepare myself for everything. I try to prepare myself mentally for everything. Because you never know, but strangely enough, the things I'm prepared for don't seem to happen. And I'll just turn this around and ask you guys I'm sure we'll see some comments here. I'll stick around for a few minutes too. to see what you guys have to say who are watching live. But I know that most people who watch this show are armed, and most people that are our fans have firearms. It's pretty straightforward and obvious to me. And I was wondering how many of you think about this. How many of you have ever given thought about, am I going to have to use this firearm? Not against a criminal. That's kind of a no-brainer. Have you given thought to the idea that someday may come when you're going to be in the same situation as these poor Russian citizens or these poor German citizens who hear the car outdoors and now have to say, okay, we're gonna take them with us, because as I pointed out, I think in my last video or the one before that, I forget the numbers now, 6 million Jews, another 6 million homosexuals, gypsies, and so on, 12 million people. I want to say it was something like 40,000, it might have been 90,000 actual SS death squad guys. You know, if every Jew takes out every one of these guys, if one Jew takes out one of these people, if 10 Jews take out one of these people, then you run out of SS before you run out of Jews and victims and so on. But I'm curious, have you ever given serious thought? This is usually the kind of thing you think about lying at night in bed looking at the ceiling. Have you ever given serious thought to whether or not you could or would actually use that weapon? And I think that this is all of the power that they have over us. We have so much to lose. Our lives are so rich and so full. We're so far away from hardship and death that it just, I'd love to tell you, no, I'd be out there. They came for my gun, I'd be gunning. I don't suspect I would. I suspect I'd probably surrender and be arrested and hope for the best. And this is the thing that's so terrifying. I think I mentioned this on the Right Angle show about Korea. But we were talking about the prisoner's dilemma, and there's a thought experiment in the tragedy of the commons and so on. And one of them, I think, is called, the Pinto theory or something. And basically it works like this. If I drive a $200 Pinto, a car that's a piece of junk when it was made and is now 40 years old, and everybody's coming back saying, yes, I do think about it, and I hope and pray I'll be able to behave the way I would like to behave. God bless you all. I knew that was the answer. And I can't wait to see the rest of them. But here's how the Pinto theory works. The idea is that I'm driving a $200 Pinto, where every single piece of glass is cracked, the paint's totally faded, there are dings and bangs and cranks, everything on every side of the car. It's completely bashed in, missing a headlight, bumpers dragging on the ground, that kind of thing. It is the world's ultimate last level piece of crap car. It is the least valuable car that you've ever seen. You're driving this piece of crap Pinto. And you decide to merge into a lane. And at the same time, a guy also decides to merge into that same lane. And he's driving a $400,000 brand new Ferrari. This theory says that as these two cars become aware of each other and try to occupy the same space, that the Pinto is going to win because the other guy's got something to lose. You know, the Pinto doesn't care if he gets in a fender bender or dings the thing up or scratches the paint, but the guy who's got the brand new car is very, very worried about that. And this is how the situation in Korea works. Kim Jong-un basically is saying out loud, yeah, I know my country's a dump, but I can hurt you. I can't win, but I can hurt you. And you can't take being hurt. And that's the reality of it. So, I suspect that the decision on the actual outcome of whether you do or don't would be dependent largely, I think, upon how quickly it happened and how many people around you had. The longer it took, the more likely it would be that you would not resist. It's social proof, right? It's what they use. These people have our psychology down. They have our psychology down so perfectly that they understand this. They understand that if they just started arresting people and did it at a rate where everybody was terrified, but over the course of years, there would never be that moment, that snap, which is what happened at Lexington and Concord, right? I mean, and the Boston Massacre. Snap, something happens. So, where's the threshold? I've often wondered that. Have you not? We just sit here, we talk, never really, it's a nice little bow to tie these ideas up against. We talked about standing in line for our execution, just calmly taking another step forward, waiting for it to be our turn. That's kind of what we're doing right now, isn't it? I mean, we see all of these freedoms disappearing, and we know they're disappearing. We know that all this stuff is going on. We don't have a government anymore. We know that we don't have a government anymore because the primary function of the government, simplest function of the government, is to make a budget for the government. And the Republicans haven't produced a budget this year. The Democrats went 8 years without a budget. They passed continuing resolutions and executive orders and things like that. And we know that all of this freedom is being suppressed. Not being suppressed where we thought it's coming from. It's not being suppressed by guys with tanks. Being suppressed by social pressure. And we know it. We feel it. We know it. If you live in Los Angeles, you will not say out loud, I think Donald Trump's doing a great job. I don't care who you are. You will have to be 1 in a million to say that, because you know what's going to happen to you. The social proof of just that, just the opprobrium of that. We were in Jerry's Deli the other day. Evan Sayet and Tom Dreesen and I and a couple of people were just having lunch. And Evan Sayet wore, he didn't wear a Make America Great Again hat. He wore Make California Great Again red hat. We went in there and sat there, and we were in that booth for 35 minutes by my watch before finally we were able to get somebody to come over and serve us. And I could tell from the looks that other people were giving us and the looks that the people who worked at the restaurant were giving us, this is not an accident. As long as they keep turning this up slowly, we never get triggered. Triggered is the word. And this is my great fear, actually. I'm not so much worried about, I don't even really fear civil war because I'm too stupid, really, I guess. But that's not what scares me. What scares me is not doing anything. It scares me that we all go to the shooting range and we practice and we're already... Puddle Pirate says the founders would have been shooting already. You damn right they would have been shooting. They would have been shooting the day after the 16th Amendment was passed. There never would have been a 17th Amendment. But that's the point, right? I mean, that's kind of my point. The founders would have been shooting because their life was not the life of leisure that we have. Their life was filled with hardship, and you didn't live very long. You died young, mostly violently or horribly, and you were just more prepared for this. So, this is the big one. This is the big concern. And I come back to that map. That blue map of the future, is what country looks like if only millennials vote. This is what the country looks like if only non-whites vote. And it's enough to fill you with dismay. But the reason you keep hearing me constantly talking about this video game is because I'm very proud of this last firewall. I'm going to continue to do them. Let's not have any further confusion about that. I know I've sowed a lot of confusion in my own regard. But the salient point about that big blue ocean is that we do not have to convince them to behave differently. This is the point. We do not have to convince millennials to act differently than the way they're already acting. When you leave them alone, they retreat into a world where they buy guns and make money. That's all they do. They don't give up their cell phones. They don't give up their own property. Bernie Sanders has 3 houses. If these were actual revolutionaries, they would have strung him up over that. They don't know any better, but all of their actions that I can see when they're alone, I know how they behave when they're in groups, when they're on college campuses and all the rest of it, but when you leave them alone, they act like conservatives, and they want heroism. And the reason they play all of these video games is because they want to be men. They want to have a chance to live an adventure, and they want to be able to defend themselves, and they want to do something, glorious, and they want some adrenaline, and they want some action, and they want to be able to do things like defend themselves and kill people without being told how horrible and defective they are. So here we go, It's a recent analogy for me, but I've been using it a lot. I'm going to continue to use it a lot. We're Singapore. We have all our guns facing the ocean. We have the enormous fortifications facing the ocean. We're ready to defeat the Japanese Imperial Navy when they come. And we would defeat the Japanese Imperial Navy when they come. Or Imperial Japanese Navy, I guess I should say. Only they're not coming. The Japanese are coming, but they're not coming in the big warships. They're not coming in the big warships because we have such big guns aimed at the water and because we have such fortifications. We have prevented the attack that we thought was coming by being so well prepared for that attack. But that doesn't mean we prevented any attack. It just means that we put so many guns facing the water that they're not going to come at us from the water. They're coming at us from the jungle. They're coming at us from behind. The British were told that there was no way that vehicles could get through that jungle. And they were right. You couldn't get vehicles through that jungle. That's why the Japanese came up bicycles. And you couldn't turn the guns around. And I look at that blue map, and it's enough to make me want to faint dead away or run someplace. Just run. Go someplace and live out the rest of my life, where I don't have to watch this thing happen. But I look at the width of it, and then I realize it's so thin. It's so wide, but it's so shallow. It's so shallow. They are already behaving like us, and they're behaving like us because they're human beings, and our philosophy is based on human nature. Our philosophy uses human nature as a power plant, not as an obstacle that has to be overcome. And that's why it'd be so easy to flip these people. By the way, there's a great example of this, and this will be the last thought for the night, I think. A great example of this idea of how conservatism uses human nature to move forward and to achieve happiness and prosperity, while progressivism tries to remake human nature and ends up doing nothing but misery. There's actually a perfect analogy for this. Perfect. And it's the Panama Canal. Before the Americans built the Panama Canal at the turn of the last century, the French gave it a shot. They gave it a serious shot. And the French had an idea of what a canal should be. A canal is a square ditch in the ground that's filled with water that you sail your ship down. And so the French went to Panama. They laid out a route for their canal. And the first thing they had to do was they had to block the water from soaking the ground so that they could dig the steel sides of this canal, because that's what a canal is. In other words, the French went to one of the rainiest places on the planet and decided that the way to build their canal was to evacuate as much water as possible. And that didn't work. One of the reasons it didn't work was they lost a lot of people to yellow fever that were spread by mosquitoes. But mainly, it rains all the time. It's just nothing but water there all the time. And the French were trying to remove the water so they could build the canal. After they failed, the Americans went down there and gave it a try. And they looked at it and they did 2 things that the French did not do. The first thing they did was they realized that they couldn't get rid of all this water. And it was pointless to try. So a physician by the name of Walter Reed, came up with a way of mosquito control, and they started doing things like putting pesticides in there, and all of this kind of prophylactic kind of thing. But Walter Reed basically went down there and essentially eliminated the yellow fever threat because Walter Reed went after the mosquitoes. But the main thing the Americans did was they said, how about instead of fighting against this water, why don't we use the water? The water wants to go in this direction. The water is pushing everything as hard as water can. Nature is wanting this place to be wet. And the French thought it should have been dry. So the Americans said, maybe our idea of a canal is the problem. Maybe this isn't going to look like a canal in Europe, because this isn't Europe. This is where it rains in a day as much as it rains in Europe in a year. So America looked at the Panama Canal and they had a different picture in their head. They realized that we're going to have to use the water to help us. So rather than a series of ditches with steel sides that you had to pump the water out of on both sides, the American solution was just flood the place. Flood it. Flood it. Stop the water from leaving. Rains like hell here all the time. Great. So instead of a narrow little trench, we're going to have lakes. And where we can't get from one lake to another, because there are some elevation differences, there we're going to, and only there, we're going to build the locks to lower or raise the ships. But basically, we're going to flood the whole of Panama down the length of this thing. We're going to make sure the water doesn't get away. We're not going to try and remove the water. We're going to use the water. And that worked. So that's the difference between conservatives and progressives. Conservatives fashion things that work out of human nature, which is unchangeable. We use the water as an ally. The left spends their entire time trying to remake humans into something that we're not, and in the process of remaking them into this image of something that is not really appropriate, they end up killing everybody. So, I think that's a perfect example of the difference between our two philosophies. And that's why that blue map filled with these millennials say they vote for Bernie Sanders. Hillary Clinton today said she would have done much better if she hadn't been so pro-capitalism. Hillary Clinton pro-capitalism. Hillary Clinton has no idea what capitalism is. Hillary Clinton only knows what cronyism is. But she admitted, yeah, I would have done better, certainly in the primaries, if I had been less capitalist and more socialist. And they all believe this. And this is how they think this is how they call themselves. And this is, in fact, how they vote. It's not an illusion. It's true. This is how they vote. But you take any one of these Bernie Sanders supporters. If you gave me a day to walk around any Bernie Sanders supporters, I guarantee you I could find 20 instances of any one of them in any given day where the hypocrisy of what they say versus what they do is so shocking that you have to be seriously mentally ill to not see it. Bernie himself being the perfect example. You have 3 houses. Explain that part to me again. Because I got the whole share with the people who have less than you. And I got the whole, those evil banker bastards have these mansions everywhere while people are going homeless. I got all that. The thing I don't get is, how do you have 3 houses? And you might ask how the person who brought socialism to Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, who said that all the people have to be equal, you might wonder how his daughter has $4.5 billion. Could feed the entire starving country, but she doesn't. She keeps it for herself. Fidel Castro. Oh, I'm going to wear army fatigues for the rest of my life. Man of the people. The Cuban people loved him. They do. You're nuts if you deny it. They love him. Loved him and continue to love him. Admire him and keep voting for more of the same. Because they're convinced that while everybody's suffering, Fidel is suffering too. Look at him. He's not wearing a suit. He's not driving around in a limousine. He's a regular guy in fatigues. He's a regular guy in fatigues who died with $900 million in his personal bank account. That's the end of the argument, folks. There's no socialism argument after this. It's by any rational, half rational, 10th rational standards, It's over. It's not like I beat you. You beat yourself. I didn't come up with a better point than you did. You came up with the better point than I did. I tell you capitalism works for people and that they want to do it, and you tell me that they don't, and the people who are telling me the most that they don't are the ones that are doing it the most. And it's back to the whole hypocrisy thing. So an incredible weapon, and we had better be prepared to use it, is all I have to say, because we have to use it. I don't think the time is running out in terms of the opportunity, but in terms of the electoral map, yeah. And if all these people vote away our ability to speak to each other like we're doing tonight, then we're in serious trouble. Well, now, 10 minutes to 8, that show is almost, I can tell you, I started the quick time. Where are you, baby? 1 hour, 35 minutes, and 50 seconds ago. So that will be our Stratosphere Lounge for today. We ended up having to save a bunch of Stratosphere Lounge. What is this? 182, 183? Is it 184? I'll look it up. I don't know, whatever. Anyway, thanks very much for joining us. It's great to be here. Sorry about the confusion at the beginning. We'll try and do better and get this out of there and so on. Till then, you guys be careful out there. Thanks again for all the fish. And I guess we'll see you next time. Okay. Now I will begin the process of hitting the 11 mouse clicks needed to shut down this process when there used to be only one.